Let's talk about some of the things we can do with the Unity terrain component. I have an empty scene with a camera and a light. From the game object menu, I'll choose 3D object terrain. This creates a terrain object in the scene, and it also creates an object in the assets folder called new terrain. Now I'll name the terrain asset. When I have the terrain selected in the hierarchy view, I can see some tool options that I have. I have sculpting and texturing options, as well as terrain settings, which gives me a view into a little bit more detail about how this terrain is constructed and how it renders. Now let's go through the terrain tools. I'm going to use the raise lower terrain tool, zoom out a bit, and take a look at what I can do. I can select from any of the brushes here. I can set a brush size, opacity, and begin painting. Now, it can be a good idea to switch between looking at your scene from outside to get an overview of the terrain and getting in close to what your playable character position would be, so you can actually get a sense for what the terrain feels like when you're looking around in it. One strategy for sculpting terrain might be to start from the overview and start with larger brushes and get the overall size of your terrain sculpted the way you like it. So I may think of playing somewhere in the middle of this terrain object. So I would want to close in the horizon a little bit, maybe add features for areas where I want the player to explore. I'm just raising up the outer edges a bit. And then start adding detail and getting closer for sculpting really specific details. My lighting right now is a little bit too bright to make this easy to see, so I may want to do a quick change to the directional light just to make it a little bit less intense. That makes it easier to see what I'm doing without everything blowing out. I'll go back to my terrain and paint some more with this tool. I can make the brush smaller and get in really close. Now you can see that the brush looks pixelated on the surface when I'm at this resolution or at this brush size looking close up. That's because the texture resolution of this terrain is 512 or 513 pixels. When you have this sculpting tool, the raise lower tool active, you can raise or lower by holding shift when you're painting. You're lowering terrain. By holding no modifier key, you're raising terrain. So I can quickly switch between raising and lowering to get an area worked out the way I like. And if this gets out of control, I can switch over to the smoothing brush. The next tool over from the raise lower tool is the paint height tool. This can be really useful for painting essentially plateaus or areas you want to be flat. I'll set the height to what I want, let's say 40. Set the brush size somewhere useful. And at this point I want the opacity to be 100%. Oop, that height is a bit too high, I think. I'll undo and set the height lower. Let's do 10. So you can see by stepping to different heights I can make platforms for, if I want to create architecture or play areas within the game. And if I decide that my entire level is messed up and I want to start over, I could click the flatten button. That flattens the whole terrain to 0. Or possibly, no, to whatever height is set. So if I change this to 0, it'll flatten down to 0. If I set it higher, then the entire terrain will be flattened to that height. So that can also be a good way to start a level if you want to start at a certain height and then sculpt into it to go down. Now, changing the terrain resolution is something you can do. If I want to switch over to the terrain settings, this gear icon, I can scroll in and look for height map resolution. Right now it's set to 513. Let's try setting this higher. And it's a good idea to set this to a power of 2 plus 1. So I'll try 1025. That's 1024 plus 1. And it gives you a little tooltip. Should be power of 2 plus 1. Press enter, and that actually will reset the terrain because it doesn't know what to do with existing terrain. It would have to smooth things out or anti-alias. I'll switch back to terrain painting and add in some detail again. Now, one thing you can see right now is sometimes my brush starts to stutter and it looks like it's dropping in only a few stamps every once in a while. The reason is down here in the lighting section, it has heightmap static set, and you can see down at the very bottom that it says it's baking. What that means is it's trying to calculate lighting, and every time I make a change, it has to start over. So I want to turn off the heightmap static setting for now, and that will prevent it from baking the lighting. I may want to re-enable that later and allow it to calculate the lighting so that real-time lighting doesn't have to impact the performance of the scene later, but that's a topic for another day. Now we'll go back in and continue painting. And you can see with the resolution set higher, I get a little bit more fidelity in the terrain. And I can create more detailed areas. Now, one thing this doesn't give me is an easy ability to create ramps or geometric shapes. I can paint all sorts of different shapes, but getting geometric precision can be difficult with this tool. So, as an example, I'll try to create 2 different plateau levels and a smooth ramp in between. I'll use my set height brush, set the height to 0, and paint into this area. Now, if I want to make this something I can walk in or out of easily by walking up a ramp to the next level, I want to first put a character controller in here, and I'll use standard assets that I already have imported. First-person character, prefab, FPS controller. I'll drop it right down there. And I can see I'm using the frustum of the camera to aim my initial setting, but I can also look at the camera through the preview to see that it looks how I want, or in the game view. I also want to delete my original camera and click play to see how this works. So I can see I have a steep wall here. With this controller I can sort of jump scale the wall, but that's not how I want the game to play. So in order to deal with this texture in a different way, I could export the texture and edit it in Photoshop or even ZBrush or Mudbox or some other 3D sculpting tool. So in the settings for the terrain, this terrain settings area under the gear, I'm going to scroll down to heightmap and choose export raw. And this brings up an export heightmap window. It has the width and height set to what I set the terrain resolution or heightmap resolution. It's going to be 16-bit. We do want that. Byte order, generally leave it at whatever it defaults to, and click export. And I'll leave this named as it is, terrain.raw. That's replacing a file that I tested earlier. Now, in order to look at that file, I can drag it right into Photoshop from my desktop, and it will give me a Photoshop Raw Options import dialog. And it has tried to guess, but it might not always do a good job. In this case, 1025 I know is the pixel size. It has one channel because it's grayscale. It's 16 bits, and I think the byte order was MAC, so we'll see what happens. So the byte order is not MAC. If you see this kind of psychedelic patterny looking thing, then that means that the byte order has been reversed. So I want to close that and try the import again. And this time choose the opposite byte order. Click OK. And now I see something that looks more like what I expect. Now if I use the levels tool in Photoshop, I can see that my map is actually, it looks very dark. All of the values are bunched up on this side of the histogram. I can check it to see how bright things really are, and I can see that my flat path is up here, and this is the plateau that I painted down to 0. I don't want to use the levels command to actually affect this, though. Because we're looking at 16-bit values, the monitor can't display the full range of brightness. So in order to edit, sometimes what I do is add an adjustment layer that is the levels command. And the adjustment layer is where I can set my levels preview. So I can focus in on a range of levels that are dark. Zoom in and do some editing. The levels layer is used to preview values that I can't otherwise see very well. Now, in order to sample from this layer in order to match values, I need to choose the eyedropper tool and change the sample method from all layers to I'll do all layers, no adjustments. That way when I sample this color, it's actually sampling without the level adjustment being applied. Then I can switch to my background color and sample this color. Use the gradient tool, and I'll first lasso select the area that I want to be my ramp. Use the gradient tool and paint in that gradient. Now I can zoom in and see that at the top end this matches pretty well, and at the bottom end it fades in nicely. Now in order to get these edits back to Unity, I need to turn off the levels layer, choose File, Save As, set the Save As type to Photoshop Raw, and I'll name this something new so that I don't overwrite the original in case I want to go back to it. Click Save, and now I get Photoshop Raw options. This defaulted to OK settings. You want the header to be 0 and the byte order to be whatever it was when you started. And I chose IBM PC there. Then I'm going to switch back to Unity, and back in the Terrain Objects, Terrain Settings tab, down at Heightmap, I'll choose Import Raw, select the file that I just created, and it is trying to take a guess at what the heightmap settings are. I think it's going to be based on what was previously exported, and it may or may not guess right, so you have to be sure that you know what the settings are. I'm choosing 16-bit, 1025 by 1025, that's the size that I was working in Photoshop, and these values look good. It's 500 by 500 with a 600 height, and click Import. Now it looks like things didn't change significantly, but as I get in closer, you'll see that ramp has been added. And I can click play to see how it looks and how it feels. Looks okay. Now I'll look at the smoothing tool. The smoothing tool is pretty simple and direct. I just click and drag with any of these brushes, opacity set to something noticeable. And if I've previously made some adjustments that were not very smooth and I want to smooth those out, I can choose the smoothing tool, and this averages out pixels. It's basically like a blur brush in Photoshop. Now we'll look at the texture painting tool. I've selected the texture painting tool. I click Edit Texture here and Add. Under Albedo, I want to choose Select and then Browse for an image. Click Add. And now you can see that the texture is tiling, so I may want to change the size of it in this window as well. I'll set the size to 500 by 500, and that should correspond to the whole size of the terrain object. You can see that it's applied the texture to the entire object, so I don't have to actually paint anything. But if I want to add more textures, I can add in a list of textures and do some manual painting to blend between textures. So I press Edit Textures again, Add Texture, select under Albedo, and pick a new image. Again, I set the size of it and click Add. This time it doesn't add it directly, but it does add that image to the list. So I can pick a brush, select the texture, and start painting. Now you can see right now I have size, opacity, and strength set all the way up. If I set opacity lower and choose the other picture, I can blend back. And in this way, you could layer textures pretty effectively. Now, one other way to work with the terrain object is to import existing height maps. I'm creating a new terrain object. I have an existing image that is a laser scan of a crater. There are a lot of ways to acquire height maps. One is simply to go to Google and search for something like height map, and I'll do grayscale to see if that helps narrow the search results. Choose image search, and I get a bunch of interesting results right off the bat. Some of these maps are computer generated, some of them are sampled by laser or other methods from real geological features. You can also acquire height map data from the USGS directly at earthexplorer.usgs.gov, and you can search for specific areas. I can click the Use Map button to define an area based on the current window settings. Now I want to choose data sets and specifically look for the kind of data that I want. I want digital elevation, and I'm not sure which of these I want yet. I'm going to select all of these and then try downloading the results. This one doesn't look so good. This one looks pretty good. And I could click download, but that will take me to a login required area. I can just right click and save this image, but that will give me a grayscale JPEG, which may not be detailed enough for what I want. It is 512 by 512, but that's small and it's not 16-bit. You can register on this site and download the full data sets and then edit them in Photoshop or some other tool before you import. If I want to use one of these images to sculpt terrain in Unity, I need to first open it in Photoshop, change the mode to grayscale. It will ask me if I want to discard color information. That's fine. And I also need to set the mode to 16 bits per channel and save as Photoshop RAW. Again, this brings up the raw options. The header is 0. The byte order is inconsequential as long as you use the same option in both programs. And now we'll return to Unity and import that height map. Again, the import height map dialog asks me for width and height, sets the terrain size, byte order. It has made a guess, and it may be close, but I think the terrain height is actually going to be a little bit extreme because that image was it had a wide range of colors, and the height will end up being like 16,000 instead of something normal low. It'll be near the upper limit of a 16-bit image. So I want to set the height actually pretty small. I'll start with 50 and click import. And you can see that that did an okay job. I may have actually chosen a value a little too high for the height, so I'll try this again. Set the value lower. Let's try 20. And from far away you can see the detail of the crater, but up close you might just sort of get the sense that you're in a crater. The game controller is in here. I need to find it and put it somewhere reasonable. And press play. So now I'm in an alien landscape. It's a little hard to tell from here that I'm in a crater, but I could make the height a little bit more extreme to emphasize the fact that it has this radial structure to it. In the settings for the terrain object, I also have some options for how close to stick to the original pixel size by distance. So I can optimize this by allowing the terrain to get much less detailed the farther you get from it. And with it set to a really high value, that is going to look pretty bad. So I'll set this fairly low. This way, if I fly away in my spaceship, I'll actually see those craters. The base map distance sets the distance at which terrain textures will be displayed at full resolution. So that shows a low resolution sort of copy of the terrain texture from farther away. I can choose to cast shadows or not cast shadows from this terrain. This is relatively flat, and if your lighting is mostly overhead, then you may not want it to cast shadows. The material you can change to a range of different shaders, including custom. You can just drop any shader onto this custom material. Now let's create a tree. So this creates the tree at the origin, and using that tree I can actually paint trees directly onto the mesh using my tree brush. In order to paint trees, I need to add a tree to the tree brush. I'll click Edit Trees, Add Tree, and drag this tree from the project window onto the tree prefab. Click Add, and then I can start painting in a forest. Now I have a forest of all pretty simple, weird hair trees. I'm feeling like a flea suddenly, like I'm on a dog. And finally, there's the Paint Details tool. This allows us to add in things like grass textures or detail meshes if I want extra meshes added into my scene. And to test this, I'll just create a cube, drag this into my project window to make a prefab out of it, drag the cube into my detail texture, and try painting this in. And now I have a sea of strange box grass. Now the last step I want to take is to turn the light map static option back on and allow the lighting to bake. And with the lighting baked, it should run a little bit faster in real time. And those are some of the basics of working with terrain in Unity.